The standard response to all of this: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, assumes the system designed to evaluate extraordinary evidence is operating in good faith. And the GenBank story alone should make you question that assumption. A genetic sequence matching nothing in the known biological record was submitted to the world's official genetic database. The database refused to accept it because it was attributed to a species that doesn't officially recognize. What? That species isn't officially recognized, partly because the sequences aren't in the database. That's not science, folks. That's a door that locks from the inside. All right. There's a forensic DNA study sitting in a published journal right now that says Sasquatch is real. Not a blog, not a Reddit thread, a 5-year forensic DNA study. 8 institutions, 111 samples, 3 complete genomes sequenced at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, one of the most respected genomics facility in the country. The researchers couldn't get it peer-reviewed, not because the data fell apart under scrutiny, because no mainstream journal would agree to review it at all. So the lead researcher did something the scientific community has never forgiven her for. She purchased her own journal and published it herself. And then GenBank, the world's official repository for all known genetic data, refused to accept the sequences the study produced. The reason? The sequences didn't match anything in the entire recorded history of life on Earth. That's either institutional science protecting its credibility or institutional science protecting something else entirely. And after spending serious time with this data, I can tell you the line between those two things is thinner than most people are comfortable admitting. Welcome to Broadcasting Seeds. I'm your host, Ben Tanton. And before we go any further, if you like, if this kind of episode is why you're here, take 10 seconds, hit subscribe, leave a review on Spotify or podcast, Apple Podcasts or YouTube or wherever you're watching this or listening, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Send this episode to a friend who still thinks this is a joke. Every one of those actions is how the show finds new listeners, and it matters more than you can know. Now, back to this problem, okay? By the end of this episode, you're going to understand 3 things. 3. What the actual data, not the folklore, not the cable TV specials, but the raw numbers from an 18,000 report sighting database. It's not just one, but it's multiple. Actually point to. You're going to understand what the Ketchum DNA study found, why no one in mainstream science would peer review it, and why refusing to look at evidence isn't the same thing as disproving it. And you're going to understand why Native Americans and First Nations peoples across this continent never needed a scientific journal to confirm what they've documented for centuries, and why the zones where their oral traditions are the oldest are the exact zones with the highest number of sightings density. I'm naming this episode, This is Sasquatch the Truth. Not the version that gets mocked off the internet, not campfire stories, right? The version that lives in the numbers. Here's the problem with how most people approach this topic. The mainstream dismissal runs on a single, seemingly airtight logic: no confirmed body, no proof. And for most people, that's the end of the conversation, right? You either believe or you don't. The joke writes itself. Move on. But that binary doesn't, it does something dishonest. It flattens all the documented entries in Bigfoot sightings, in databases and reports spanning every forested state in the continental United States. Most of them from ordinary people with nothing to gain from this. It just reduces it into a punchline, and it erases dozens of independent indigenous traditions, dozens, predating every European arrival on this continent. That all describe the same creature with the same behavioral markers in the same geographic regions where reported clusters are today. It glosses over the fact that the federal agencies managing the national forests and federal land where the highest sighting density zones sit are the same agencies with the long institutional history of deciding certain questions aren't worth asking. And it completely buries the DNA study where the lead researcher, frankly, a veterinarian and licensed forensic scientist, couldn't find a single peer-reviewed journal willing to evaluate her findings. So the scientific community got to dismiss it on publication grounds without ever opening the data. Is that a Sasquatch government cover-up? Maybe. Not in the way people usually mean it, but an institution that won't look and then cites not having looked as its reason for disbelief. That's its own kind of suppression, all right? And the mainstream keeps laughing. The data hasn't gotten the memo. So let's look at what the data actually says. Section 1, the data. If you pull up the Bigfoot mapping project right now, you can see, and it's publicly available, Bigfoot mapping project, 16,000 plus entries, interactive map. The first thing that strikes you isn't the volume, right? It's the shape. The reports don't scatter randomly across the country the way a hoax or a mass delusion would. They cluster, I mean hard, along specific geographic corridors that follow a consistent pattern. Old growth forest cover, elevation gradient, and proximity to permanent water sources. Washington State has 724 BFRO verified sightings. That's the Bigfoot Research Organization. Verified sightings, the highest of any state. It also works out to, it's about 9.12 per 100,000 residents, the highest per capita rate in the country. But the raw number misses the more interesting detail. Those reports aren't evenly spread across Washington State. They're concentrated in a band running down the western slope of the Cascades, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, the Olympic Peninsula, the Hoh and Quinault rainforest systems. There's some words in here, folks, that I'm going to have some trouble with. So I've tried to study them, but you'll see. It's not just the Pacific Northwest. It's a specific corridor, a spine that runs south to north. It goes north to south into Northern California, the Six Rivers National Forest, the Hoopa Valley watershed, the Trinity Alps. It runs north from there into British Columbia, into the Fraser Valley, into the exact region where the word Sasquatch actually originates from. Then there's a second concentration entirely, the Appalachian chain, the Appalachian Mountains, unbroken forest running from Maine to Georgia, feeding into the Ohio River Valley from where southeastern Ohio alone has roughly 280 verified reports concentrated in the Appalachian foothills. I'm not even talking about Pennsylvania at this point, but the Ouachita and Ozark systems in Arkansas and Oklahoma, separated from the Appalachian cluster by the Mississippi floodplain, and down in Florida, right? Where 48 of 67 counties had documented sightings as far back as 2010, and accounts in a written record stretch back to 1818. When you step back from that map, what you're looking at is a distribution pattern that follows the continental forest systems almost exactly. Now, the skeptics' most credible argument is this: that pattern looks like black bear habitat. And absolutely it does. Josh Stevens, a PhD candidate from Penn State, ran a formal GIS analysis for more than 3,300 BFRO data points and found significant correlation with black bear range. His conclusion was that the whole phenomenon is likely explained by misidentification. I mean, it's a fair argument. It's also incomplete, because black bears don't leave bipedal tracks with consistent 5-foot stride length or for hundreds of yards through soft substrate. They don't produce footprints with dermal ridges, the equivalent of fingerprints, right? That physical anthropologist Grover Krantz and fingerprint analysis Jimmy Childs both identified, independently examined, and concluded could not be faked with a carved wooden prop. You'd need a flexible skin-like surface with actual biological structure. And black bears don't show up in the behavioral data the way these reports do, right? Here's a detail that almost no one in the mainstream conversation has picked up. The Sasquatch Data Project, an independent research initiative with 2,900 plus parsed reports, right? Terrestrial, amazing job. That's all I have to say to you. And 180 separate variables found that sightings cluster disproportionately around new moon phases. Not full moon phases, right? New moons. The darkest nights of the month. That's not a random scatter, okay? It's a behavioral pattern consistent with a large, primarily nocturnal animal that has learned to minimize its visibility during active movement. You don't get that from identified black bears blundering through the daylight. You don't get it from hoaxers picking the darkest nights of the month to run around in the woods in a suit, okay? You get it from something that knows when it's dark. Tim Renner's weather-enriched data set pushes this even farther, and he cross-referenced 5,021 BFRO sightings data reports with actual meteorological data: cloud cover, humidity, dew point, precipitation, wind speed, UV index, pulled from the Dark Sky API for each specific location and date. It's the only public data set in existence that links real environmental conditions to individual sighting events. What it reveals is quietly significant, right? Sightings cluster under atmospheric conditions consistent with low ambient light, and reduced human outdoor activity. Whatever this is, it appears to time its exposure. That's not folklore. That's a behavioral signature in a data set. And then there's the movement patterns. Every major database, BFRO, the Bigfoot Mapping Project, the NAWAC, independently points to the same 4 movement corridors, among others. I'm just concentrating on these 4. The Pacific Spine running down the Cascades, the Appalachian Chain, the Ouachita Ozark Arc, and the riparian networks, which the river valleys functioning as lateral highways connecting these systems. The Columbia Snake and Willamette in the Pacific Northwest, the Ohio and the Kanawha, something like that, in the east, the Arkansas and the Red Rivers in the south central, river valleys, ridge lines, forest spines, migration corridors. That there's a reasonable, even boring explanation for all this. Large mammals need food, water, and cover. Of course, reports cluster near rivers and forests. Of course, seasonal movement follows snowpack. That's just how animals work. But that explanation only holds if there's an animal to explain. The mainstream science says there isn't one. So either 18,000 plus people across 2 centuries, across dozens of states, many of them hunters, loggers, law enforcement officers, doctors, lawyers, field workers who spend their lives in the woods, are all misidentifying or fabricating the same behavioral pattern in the same geographic corridors, or something is moving through those corridors. And long before any database existed, long before a single researcher plotted a single GPS coordinate, the people who actually lived in those corridors had a name for what we were seeing. Section 2, the Indigenous record. And before there was a BFRO, before there was any databases, before Jerry Crew found those tracks in Bluff Creek in 1958, and the wire services ran photos and the word Bigfoot entered the American vocabulary, there were already thousands of years of documentation. It just wasn't the kind of documentation Western science knows how to process. All right, so I'm talking about 7 major indigenous traditions across North America describe a large, bipedal, hair-covered creature living in the deep forest. Now, 7 traditions that developed independently, separated by thousands of miles with no shared cultural pipelines, no common origin point that would explain the overlap, okay? Now, with that being said, there's something like 40 plus indigenous tribes that all have a story about these things. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, things like it. I am covering these 7 because they cover the areas that I had already brought up, right? So you've got the Stalo peoples of British Columbia's Fraser Valley, call it Sasquatch, Shahalis, right? The Lumini of northern coastal Washington call it, I cannot even pronounce that, folks, and I'm sorry. I've tried, but I just cannot. The Quinault of the Olympic Peninsula is very similar to that, and I can't pronounce it either. So the Hoopla Valley, the Yurok, the Carux people, modern California, call it Uma, boss, which means boss of the woods. The Cherokee of the southern Appalachian call it Chickley and Coodley, of the southern Appalachians call it that, right? The Seminoles of Florida wetlands carry accounts that predate European settlement of this region. The Yakima, Nez Perce, and Umatilla and Warm Springs people of the Columbia Plateau describe the stick Indian. And I can't say that either, but it's like the Ishtayaha, a creature associated with rivers and forest edges that causes psychological disorientation in those who encounter it. All right. So this is where the word Sasquatch comes from. The word Sasquatch was born in the British Columbia's Fraser Valley, essentially. Okay. 7 traditions, 7 geographic regions. And when you plot them against the modern sightings database, every single one aligns directly with the highest density. Again, there are over 40 different tribes with Bigfoot-like creatures in their lore, but I'm sticking with these for this video, okay? Fraser Valley sits at the heart of the Pacific Spine Corridor. The Olympic Peninsula is one of the densest sighting zones on the continent. And the Six Rivers watershed in Northern California is where the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot. Now, I know there's been some recent stuff trying to discredit that film, but I really haven't covered it, and I've kind of stayed out of it on purpose. But that is a whole nother episode, okay? Southeastern Ohio, Cherokee, and Appalachian Territory is the center of what researchers call the grassman concentration. The Florida wetlands carry 200 plus years of consistent accounts, distinctive enough that researchers treat the characteristic odor as a biological marker. And the Columbia Plateau Stick Indian Territory sits directly over the riparian corridor connecting the Pacific Spine to the interior Northwest. This is not a coincidence of geography. These peoples didn't place their traditions in these locations because it was convenient. They placed them there because that's where the encounters happened. Now, here's the part that should make the skeptics uncomfortable, period. The Stick Indian tradition, documented in the historical record as far back as the 1800s, doesn't just describe a large, hairy creature, it describes specific behavior. The Stick Indian mimics sounds, particularly whistling. It causes witnesses to feel disoriented and confused, even paralyzed with unease. It steals fish from camps and river sites. And Reverend Elkanah Walker, a missionary working among the Spokane people, wrote about these accounts in his diary in 1838, nearly 120 years before Jerry Crew's tracks made national news and Bigfoot was born, right? Those same behavioral details, sound mimicry, wood knocking, a feeling of being watched or psychologically destabilized. You've got food taken from campsites. These all appear consistently in modern encounter reports across every major database. Think about that for a second, okay? A behavioral description documented in missionary journals in 1838 showing up in independently submitted field reports in 2024, 2025, today. That's not cultural contamination. The people filling BFRO reports out in Ohio or Arkansas aren't drawing from Spokane oral tradition. They're describing what they experienced. And what they experienced matches what the Yakima and Nez Perce and Warm Springs people described to a missionary nearly 200 years ago. the territory sits in the heart of Fraser Valley. This is the Chehalis hotspot in Columbia, British Columbia, and don't describe Sasquatch as an undiscovered animal. They describe it as a being that exists on the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual one, and it's capable of moving between both. They say that seeing a Sasquatch means you are in the right place at the right time. It's not a threat, it's a signal. And for most Western listeners, that framing is easy to dismiss, right? Spiritual language around a creature that science says doesn't exist. Sounds like mythology. Absolutely. But here's the thing about that dismissal. The same scientific establishment that would call the Chehalis worldview unscientific spent decades telling the public that UAP sightings were weather phenomenon and pilot confusion. It told us for years that doctors reporting opioid-related patient harm were overstating the risk. The track record of institutional science on questions it doesn't want to engage in is not as clean as its confidence suggests, okay? And that's something else. The OPB journalist covering Indigenous perspectives on this topic wrote in 2025, for many Indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest, Bigfoot is a living and powerful part of their identities that requires zero proof of existence. Zero proof of existence. Not because the evidence is weak, because the question itself, prove it, show me the body, is the wrong freaking question. It's a Western scientific framework being imposed on a relationship that predates that framework by thousands of years. The Chehalis aren't waiting for a peer-reviewed paper, man. And neither are the Cherokee. Neither are the Iroquois. They've been living alongside this thing since before the concept of peer review freaking existed. Which brings us to the one researcher who actually tried to produce that peer-reviewed paper, who spent 5 years across 8 institutions analyzing 111 samples and found something that the entire scientific establishment decided, without reviewing, that it didn't want to know. Section 3, the DNA. All right, Dr. Melba Ketchum is a veterinarian and forensic scientist, not a hobbyist, not a podcaster with a theory like me, a licensed forensic scientist with decades of professional experience in DNA diagnostics, running an accredited laboratory in Texas. She still, to this day, runs a accredited DNA laboratory in Texas. Now, when she began what would become a 5-year study into biological samples attributed to Sasquatch, she wasn't operating outside the bounds of science. She was applying standard forensic methodology to an unusual set of samples. What she found turned into one of the most controversial and most systematically avoided documents in the history of American science, in my opinion. The study involved 8 institutions: Texas A&M University, UT Southern Medical Center, the University of North Texas, New York University, Paleo Labs in Ontario, and 3 additional research labs. 111 samples from 34 collection sites across 14 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces. You had hair, you had blood, you had tissue, you had saliva, 5 years of analysis. Let's start with the hair. The samples had shaft diameters measuring 80 to 110 micrometers. Human hair measures 55 to 100 micrometers. Most primate hair measures 50 to 80 micrometers. These samples fell above the human range, stiffer, more wiry, and couldn't be matched to any species in the reference collection. Not bear, not human, not any known animal anywhere on Earth. One tissue sample, sample 26, was sent to Texas A&M and independently to Hughley Pathology, Hugley Pathology. Both came back with the same finding. This tissue is not consistent with human skin, fewer eccrine glands and than humans have, and hair follicles clustered deeper than any known primate. The structural profile didn't match anything in their reference libraries. Then the DNA work began. And here is where the study gets genuinely strange, folks. Ketchum's team ran mitochondrial DNA analysis on all 111 samples. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally. It traces the mother's lineage. Every single sample returned a fully human mitochondrial haplotype. That all 111 confirmed across 7 independent laboratories with consistent results. 16 distinct human haplotypes identified, predominantly European and Middle Eastern in origin, with some African and American and Indian lineages present. No ape sequence, no Neanderthal, no Desnovian. Yes. The maternal line of these samples is completely unambiguously modern human. Then they ran nuclear DNA analysis. Now, nuclear DNA is the full genome inherited from both parents. Across all 24 samples tested, every single one failed the human threshold. Human control samples on the sample Illumina platform consistently score about 99, above 99. The Ketchum samples scored between 53 and 89%. And here's the detail that makes the contamination argument difficult to hold. The team deliberately degraded a known human DNA sample and ran it through the same process as a control. That sample, purposely damaged human DNA, still scored 97.15%. The Ketchum samples didn't score lower because the material was degraded. They scored lower because part of the nuclear genome doesn't appear to be human. Multiple sequences from the nuclear analysis were run through BLAST, and that's the search tool that compares genetic sequencing against everything cataloged in GenBank. They matched nothing. Not in any species, not anywhere in the recorded genetic history of life on Earth. Now, here's the specific sample that almost no one who covers the Sasquatch DNA study Ketchum conducted ever mentions. Sample 140. Blood recovered from inside a metal downspout attached to an exterior of a building. The pipe had been torn away with significant force. Fang marks on the metal, bite marks in a arced pattern with plaque and tartar residue left behind. Whatever made those bite marks through a metal pipe left biological material and walked away. 3 of the 111 samples were selected for full genome sequencing at UT Southwestern Medical Center using an Illumina HiSec 2000. The raw output was more than 90 gigabases per genome. at greater than 30 times coverage, well above the threshold for complete genomic analysis. And here is the number that directly dismantles the contamination argument. Sequencing quality is measured by Q30 scores. Scores in the 80s or 90s indicate clean, high-quality reads. Contaminated samples typically score between 40 and 50%. The 3 Ketchum whole genome sequences scored 88.6%, 88.4%, and 88.7%. These are excellent scores. Those are the scores of clean, uncontaminated sequencing. What the sequences revealed was something the researchers described as mosaic. Human nuclear DNA interspersed with novel, non-human primate sequence. The phylogenetic tree showed primate relationships consisting with the known family chimpanzee, the macaque, gibbon, marmoset, and lemur, and Homo sapiens. But threaded through the human sequence were stretches of genetic material that don't belong to any of them. And Ketchum's team proposed a species name, Homo sapiens cognatus, formally registered in ZooBank, the International Zoological Nomenclature Registry, with a legal identification number. The name exists in the scientific record. The registration is valid. That conclusion stated plainly in the paper. The data conclusively proves that the Sasquatch exist as an extant hominin and are a direct maternal descendant of modern humans. Then they tried to publish. Mainstream journals declined, not after peer review. Nope. Before it. No institution would agree to evaluate the findings. And after years of rejections, Ketchum purchased a journal, De Novo, a scientific journal of human origins, and published the paper herself. That single act handed the scientific community everything it needed. Not peer-reviewed, discussion closed, except the data doesn't close, right? Ketchum submitted the novel sequences to GenBank for cataloging. GenBank refused. The reason given was lack of taxon. The sequences couldn't be filed because they were attributed to a species GenBank doesn't recognize, which means they cannot be independently accessed, verified, or replicated through normal scientific channels. Think about the architecture of that outcome. No one would peer review the paper, so it couldn't be published in a mainstream journal. Because it wasn't peer reviewed, it could be dismissed without engaging the data. The novel sequences were submitted to GenBank, but GenBank won't catalog sequences from a species it doesn't officially recognize. Without GenBank accession, independent researchers can't access the raw data for replication. And mainstream science won't accept the findings, partly because the sequences aren't in GenBank. Wow, that's a freaking closed loop. And a closed loop is either an accident of institutional bureaucracy, or it is a system working exactly as designed to prevent a specific kind of question from ever receiving a formal answer. You can decide which one it is. What you can't honestly do is pretend that the Q30 scores don't exist, or that 7 independent laboratories all confirmed the same human mitochondrial haplotypes, or that a forensic scientist at a licensed diagnostic laboratory working with 8 co-author institutions produced contaminated results while somehow scoring nearly 40 points above the contamination threshold. Wow. The mainstream dismissal of this study is not based on data. It's based on where the data was published. And those are not the same thing at all. So here's where we are. 3 completely independent lines of evidence, 3 threads that developed across different methodologies, different cultures, different centuries, and they all pull in the same direction. The data thread, 18,000 plus documented reports clustering in specific geographic corridors that follow continental forest systems with behavioral signatures consistent with a large nocturnal animal. New moon clustering, weather-linked activity patterns, movement routes that track river valleys and ridgelines across the continent, not a random scatter, a pattern, one that has been building in the databases for decades and still hasn't produced a mainstream scientific response. The Indigenous thread, 40 plus independent oral traditions developed across thousands of miles and thousands of years with no common cultural pipeline, all documenting the same creature with consistent behavioral traits in the exact geographic zones where modern sighting density is highest. Those behavioral details, sound mimicry, psychological disorientation, nocturnal movement appear in missionary journals from 1838, in independently submitted field reports from even today, 2026. Entire civilizations that never needed a scientific institution to validate what they've been living alongside since before that institution existed. And the DNA thread, a 5-year, 8-institution forensic study, 111 samples, 7 independent laboratory confirmations of fully human mitochondrial DNA, 3 whole genome sequences with Q30 scores between 88 and 89, clean, uncontaminated reads, showing a mosaic of human nuclear DNA interspersed with genetic sequences that match nothing in the recorded history of life on Earth. A species name of Homo sapiens cognatus, registered in the International Zoological Record, and a scientific establishment that declined to review the findings, then cited not having reviewed them as the reason for dismissal. That is Sasquatch, the truth. Not the campfire version, not the television version, the version that exists when you actually sit with the evidence. I'm not going to tell you what to conclude, all right? That's not why the show exists, but I will tell you this. The standard response to all of this, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, assumes the system designed to evaluate extraordinary evidence is operating in good faith. And the GenBank story alone should make you question that assumption. A genetic sequence matching nothing in the known biological record was submitted to the world's official genetic database. The database refused to accept it because it was attributed to a species that doesn't officially recognize. What? That species isn't officially recognized, partly because the sequences aren't in the database. That's not science, folks. That's a door that locks from the inside. And if you follow the UAP disclosure story, watch the government spend 50 years calling credible military witnesses confused or delusional before quietly admitting in congressional testimony that some of those objects were real and unidentified. Then this pattern of institutional non-engagement should feel very freaking familiar. The mainstream keeps laughing, the data keeps accumulating, and somewhere in the forest corridors that run the length of this continent, something that shares our maternal DNA, that indigenous peoples have documented since before written history, that shows up in 18,000 reports with consistent behavioral signatures. 2 of those reports are from me. Is either out there or represents the most sustained, coordinated, cross-cultural hallucination in the history of the human species. One of those explanations requires a lot more faith than the other, folks. I'm sorry. Sit with that. Sit with it. If this episode hit differently than you expected, if it made you rethink something or made you want to go deeper, share it. Send it to someone who's never taken this seriously. And if you're a researcher, a filmmaker, or an investigator with evidence of a story worth telling, I want to hear from you. Reach me at broadcastingseeds.com or wherever, all the different places where you find this. If you haven't already subscribed, leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and tell someone about the show. That is genuinely how Broadcasting Seeds grows. Every review, every share, every new listener found this because someone passed it along. One more thing. If this kind of storytelling is what you want more of, I write books. The same curiosity that drives this show lives on the page too. Find them at BennettTantonBooks.com. And for everything Broadcasting Seeds, episodes, archives, research, and what's coming next, that's BroadcastingSeeds.com. This has been Broadcasting Seeds. I'm Bennett Tanton. The forest doesn't care whether you believe in it. Have a good night.
Static in the signal, footprints in the rain, something in the timber, calling out my name. They said there's nothing out there, they said don't look behind, but every locked door opens from the inside. From the inside, 18,000 whispers buried in the trees, black files, night trails, secrets on the knees, old growth breathing, riverbeds awake, something moves in silence where the ridgelines break. They laugh at the witness, they bury the tracks, call it a bear that never look back, but bears don't walk like ghosts through the pines, bears don't leave patterns in the darkest moonlight, bears don't vanish where the old maps bend, and the forest keeps talking when the data says dead. You can mock the name, you can burn the page, you can close your eyes but you can't kill the rage, you can hide the proof, you can salt the wound, but something is breathing underneath the moon. This is the truth you bury alive, a door that locks from the inside, blood in the leaves, DNA in the dirt, say it ain't real while the whole world hurts. I hear it calling from the other side, a shadow walking where the old gods hide. You can't deny it but you know I'm right, the forest doesn't care if you believe tonight. Believe tonight. 7 nations knew before the white coats came, different tongues, same beast, different only names, stick men whistling from the river bank, eyes in the hollow where the sunlight sank. They wrote it in memory, they carved it in fear, passed it down softly year after year, but your journals won't print it, your labs won't receive, your gatekeepers choke on what they can't believe. If the sequence won't match what your kingdom allows, then the truth gets buried under